Welcome to today's training on data collection, where we will discuss tracking students' progress to make data-driven decisions to support student achievement. For those of you who may be new to LaSard, we are a project within the Human Development Center at LSU Health Sciences Center in New Orleans. The Human Development Center, or HDC, is Louisiana's University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, or UCED, one of 68 in the continental U.S. and its territories. This nationwide network is a resource for addressing and finding solutions to issues that impact people with disabilities and their families through technical assistance, modules, information dissemination, and research. Why should educators take and evaluate data? First, it helps us to be as effective as we can be. If we regularly review our data and adjust our instruction accordingly, we can ensure that we are doing everything we can so students can meet their goals. It also helps keep us, as well as others who work with students with disabilities, accountable. We are constantly working on the goals agreed upon in the IEP and striving to make progress academically. When data is compiled and graphed, it can serve as a way to communicate with other professionals and family members the progress that students are making. We will walk through the steps of collecting and monitoring data. The steps are to determine the goal, select the data collection system, implement the data collection method, summarize and graph the data, and use the data to make decisions. The first step is to determine the goal. We will go from the assumption that you already have determined the goals. The team developed the goals at the IEP meeting, and we are discussing specifically how to track the goals. What can be a little more challenging is collecting data on goals that aren't directly from a permanent product based on a total score of 100. Academic classes usually use permanent products, but an academic goal may include the number of correct words read per minute, which does not result in a permanent product or a score based out of a total of 100. Many goals that you may find on IEPs may be based on observation instead of permanent products. Consider communication goals. Articulation or use of a voice output device do not result in permanent products. Same with social interactions, such as how many back and forth exchanges a student has with another student or having a conversation around a specific topic. Behavior goals and functional skill goals are usually assessed through observation. So how can teachers show that students make progress on these goals when they do not receive a typical grade? These observations can be quantified through collecting observational data. Now that we've determined the goal, the next step is to select a data collection system. The identified goal and type of skill being targeted will inform an appropriate method of data collection. As we discussed, if the outcome of the goal is tangible, you can use a permanent product. For skills that target if the student response is correct or incorrect, you can use a permanent product. For skills that target if the student response is incorrect or correct, you may consider accuracy. Duration is used if the goal relates to how long a behavior lasts. If the goal relates to counting the number of times a student does a certain skill or behavior, frequency is a data collection system to use. For some goals, you may consider latency, such as when you want to measure how long it takes a student to begin a task or perform a certain behavior after the cue or instruction is given. Here are some general examples of when you would choose each type of data collection strategy. For example, if the goal is for the student to write his or her name, that results in a permanent product that can be graded according to a rubric. If a student is working on naming letters, that goal is typically accuracy. You show them a letter and they either name it correctly or incorrectly. That accuracy data can be recorded. If we are working with a student on sustaining interactions with others, we will need to time the interactions, which will result in duration data. If we are looking at the number of initiations a student has with peers, we are counting, so that would be collecting frequency data. If we are targeting the time it takes for a student to respond to a peer that is engaging with them socially, We will record latency data. Plan out when data should be collected throughout the day. When does data need to be collected? Consider who is available across settings. Paraeducators are a great resource for data collection. Consider how frequently data should be collected. It may be different people across the week. If multiple people are collecting data, you want to make sure everyone is recording data in the same way. For example, it may be you who is collecting data during Monday, Wednesday, and Friday lunches, and a paraeducator collecting during lunch on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Review the skills or behavior definition and get everyone acquainted with the data collection sheet or method. It is helpful for you to collect together for the first few times to make sure you're reliable with each other and scoring the same. For most students and classes, the data collected is permanent products. Permanent products are typically written materials, such as worksheets or tests, but could also be a computer-based system that saves the information. Math worksheets are an example of a permanent product. Teachers typically grade the worksheets and then record that data in a gradebook. Same with spelling test. Teachers typically give a test orally, the student writes down responses, and then the teacher grades based on correct responses. This produces the number grade that is recorded as data in the gradebook. Other examples may include writing essays or questions regarding reading comprehension. This data is typically averaged over a time span and reported to the parents. This is a good example of how data can be used to communicate with family members of how a student is progressing. Accuracy data should be collected when the goal is for the skill to be performed correctly with no specific time limit. Here are some examples of when you would collect accuracy data. In reading, a student's goal may be to read a certain number of sight words. For a social goal, a student may respond correctly or not to a social bid, such as returning a greeting when another student says hi. In math, you want the student to become fluent with their multiplication facts. Here's a simple example of how you could collect accuracy data. In this example, the teacher would mark a plus if the student read the word correctly, a minus or dash if the student read the word incorrectly, or a 0 if the student did not respond. Duration data collection is the method used to document the amount of time an individual spends engaging in a behavior and is best used for behaviors that have a clear beginning and end. Use this method if your primary concern is the length of time the individual engages in the behavior. Duration recording requires some way of measuring time, using watches or stopwatches, clocks, or even videoing counting the time later. Behaviors that lend themselves to duration recording would be behaviors like the length of an interaction, the time engaged with a task, and the amount of time working in a group activity or time spent silently reading. Here is an example of a duration data sheet. For example, if you were taking data on attending to a task, you would want to first define what that looks like so everyone is on the same page. It may be that attending to task means that the student is seated at their desk with eyes on the assigned work and not talking or interacting with peers. In the first column for each observation, you should note the date, start time, and end time of the observation. As with frequency data collection, you want to make sure you are recording data for the same amount of time for each data collection period. In the second column, note where the observation was conducted and what activity was taking place. During the designated time, you would start your stopwatch when the student is attending and stop it, but don't clear it out, when the student stops by talking with a peer. Once he is back to attending to the task, you would start the stopwatch again. When the observation is complete, write the total time in the duration column. To determine the percent of the observation the student was engaged in the target behavior, divide the total minutes of duration by the total minutes observed. For example, if a student was engaged for 3 minutes of a 10-minute observation, you would write that the student was engaged for 30% of the observation. It can sometimes be difficult to accurately record the exact duration of the behavior, but as long as you define the scale or behavior as best as you can, so everyone is measuring the same behavior, it should be reliable. Also note that duration recording not only tells us how long a student engages in the behavior, but it automatically provides us with how many times the behavior occurred. Frequency data collection involves counting the number of times a behavior occurs in a specific time period. Use that the behavior can be easily counted and the behavior has a clear beginning and end. Frequency data can be collected for any skill you can count easily. For example, the number of social initiations or exchanges during recess, or the number of requests during lunch. This could also be the number of words read correctly per minute. Here's an example of a frequency data collection form. For this form, you would write the target behavior on the top line. You want to be sure this is clear so anyone taking data will know exactly what to count. In the first column, you would write the day and time of the observation, including the start and stop time, so you can accurately determine the frequency for a certain time frame. In the second column, you would note where the observation was conducted and what activities were observed. In the third column, you would simply write a tally mark where you see the behavior occur. And at the end of the observation, you count up all the tallies and write the number in the final or total column. Latency is the method utilized to document the amount of time between a cue and the student's response. Behaviors that lend themselves to latency recording would be how long it takes a student to respond to a question or greeting. Another example may be to move toward an exit within so many seconds of the cue, such as a fire alarm. Some students take a long time getting started with their work. Latency data could be used to determine how long it takes for a student to get started working after directions are given. Here's an example of a latency data collection sheet. In this example, the goal is for the student to respond quicker to a greeting from a peer. The observer records the time of the greeting and the time of the student's response, then records the latency. If you have a stopwatch or timer handy, you could also start the timer when the other student greets and then stop the timer when the student responds. For more complex skills or skills with multiple steps, it may be helpful to break the skill down into steps, like in a task analysis, and collect data on each step performed correctly. For example, when working with the self-help skill of toileting, break down each step. This could look like walk into the bathroom, walk to the toilet, unbutton pants, and so on. Note which steps the student is performing correctly or incorrectly. This is helpful information to know where you need to target your teaching. You can also note what the level of prompting is needed for the student to perform the skill correctly. For example, using the same toileting example, your goal is for the student to use the toilet independently. If you need to physically prompt the student for certain steps, it's useful to collect data on that so you know when to try to fade the prompts. After data is collected, for many educators, you end up with binders or folders full of data collection sheets that are reviewed during progress report times or annually for IEP reviews. To truly make good use of data, it should be reviewed and summarized frequently. This will help your team make decisions on how to best meet the goals for students. And having binders full of data doesn't tell the story of progress a student made. Many of us are visual learners. When you're in a meeting and can show a graph that depicts students' progress, it's powerful. Here are some ways you can do that. At the bottom of your graph is the x-axis. Here you can put the date or session number. On the side is the vertical or y-axis. This shows the range of scores or frequency or time that the student is likely to exhibit. Data should be collected before you start intervening. In other words, before you start trying to teach a skill to a student, how much can they do on their own? This is your baseline. In this example, we're looking at how long a student can maintain a conversation. This averages around 20 seconds. The part circled is the intervention. Once we started teaching the skill to the student, we continue to take data so we can see if the student progresses. In this example, you can see over time the student increased the amount of time he can maintain conversations. He went from around 20 seconds in baseline to around 110 seconds during intervention, or almost 2 minutes. If you were to take data on one more day and he maintained conversation for 120 seconds, where would you plot it? And then you would join it to the series with the line. This student is continuing to make progress on his goal. Next, we're going to determine how to use the data to make decisions. Determine when you will review the data, weekly, monthly. Choose a time that the educational team that is working on the same goal can get together. For example, if you're working on a communication goal, make sure the speech language pathologist, special educator, the general educator or paraeducator, and anyone else that has been supporting the student can meet to determine if the student has met their goal. During this time, look at the graph data together to make a decision of where to go next. As we mentioned earlier, don't just wait for progress report time. Data should be continuously reviewed for students to make optimal progress. Once you have determined a regular time to meet to review data, you want to determine what your decision rules are. For some, they consider the goal mastered if the student has reached the criteria for 10 consecutive days. Your team makes these decisions. Here are some examples of data-based decisions. Looking at the graph data, if the student is making adequate progress, again, based on the decision rules determined by your team, keep on doing whatever your team is doing. Teaching the same way and using the same reinforcement seems to be working. If your student has mastered a skill, you can introduce a new skill or increase the criteria. For example, if your goal was for a student to interact with 3 different peers throughout the day, you may consider increasing this to 5 peers, or you could work on a different but related skill, such as increasing the number of social exchanges. If you determine that no progress is being made, you may want to look at how the student has responded. Maybe the student needs different supports, such as assistive technology. Or you may want to consider shaping their responding. Maybe break the skill down with the task analysis and determine what the student can and cannot do, and then work on smaller steps. If the student is making progress, but it's slow, you may consider the antecedents. Do you need to vary the prompting level or provide additional supports, like a visual support or social narrative? If the student's progress is inconsistent, we know that the student can do the skill, but they are not using it all the time. This is known as a performance deficit. So we should look at the reinforcers used to increase the student's motivation to perform the skills. Provide choices, consider a menu of reinforcers, or have the students self-monitor their own progress. Let's look at a few examples and determine the decision and next steps. Take a look at this data. What do you think the decision should be? If you said adequate progress and the team should continue, you are correct. Take a look at this data. What is your decision? If you said no progress is being made and the team should simplify or shape responding, you are correct. Take a look at this data. What is your decision? If you said inconsistent progress and you should work to improve student motivation, you are correct. Take a look at this data. What is your decision? If you responded that the progress is slow and antecedents should be modified, you are correct. We have now gone through the 5 steps of data collecting and decision making. For additional resources, you can visit our website, lasard.org, where you can click on online resources and find a wealth of resources and related to the following categories: home environment, behavior, communication, and social. Thank you. Please take a minute to complete the training evaluation. Use your phone to scan the QR code.